everyone. This is an Insight conversation as part of the ATL Education Expo 2021. I'm here with Tyce Miller, the founder and CEO of MobileMind, which provides modern professional learning for schools and districts and really helps just bring that entire process of professional learning into the 21st century. Tyce, thank you so much for giving me your time today.
Thank you, Ian. Happy to be here. Appreciate it.
So I'd love to start out. You are one of the only folks that I've gotten a chance to get a hold of in the edtech side of things here in Atlanta. So we're going to talk about that in a bit. I want to know how you yourself got into education in Atlanta in the first place.
Yeah, it's really funny because it was accidental. So, my background's longtime enterprise software sales guy. And not to go too in the weeds, but back in the day, I got into the mobile space. And I say back in the day, so I think, 2010, 2011, ended up getting pulled over to a company called AirWatch, which was a very great success story in the Atlanta area that was ultimately acquired by VMware. And, I got to AirWatch and I was hired initially to be a sort of the large account individual contributor. That was kind of the gig that I had talked to the chairman, Alan, and the CEO, John, about, who I ultimately reported to. And when I got there, they said, hey, you know what, we really got this education thing going on where we need somebody to build out the ed tech space. And would you be interested? And I always say this and I say this humbly, and I say it because I'm passionate about it now. And my first response was, no, that is where cool software sales dudes would die. I mean, I do not want to go sell to schools. And which is, to me, it always stuck with me because I really did have that initial thought. But at that time, for me personally, I wanted the opportunity to build out a team. That gave me the opportunity. And I also, both of my kids were, 5 and 6 at the time. And, around 2011. And I said, well, there's something here. This was when, so for those of the folks that don't understand, AirWatch was a mobile device management company. So it was managing and securing mobile devices, both in the corporate space and obviously the education space, where this is this pertains talking about. So I said, you know what? Every kid's going to have a mobile device. This is different. I want to tackle this. I said, all right, let's do this. And I didn't know much about education at all. Just started, getting after it, built a team. Fast forward, that team scaled from, reps to 50 at its highest point, generating quite a bit of revenue over the course of 3 years. We got 2,000 customers.
Wow.
And that's it. So how to MobileMind, if you want me to go ahead and skip over and explain that, I can.
Yeah, sure.
Essentially, while I was in that space, okay. So while I was in that space, you got to think we're dealing with all these different types of schools, most of them K-12. And what I saw as a layman, and I say that as a non-educator, is that while I was there, we were working mainly with IT departments to roll out security software on these devices. But I started engaging at conferences, talking to instructional technology leaders, things like that. And what became very apparent is that teachers were not using this technology. All right. And so for me, I mean, I could tell you story after story where it was kind of like, really up in your face. Like, how is this even happening? You're buying all this stuff and no one's using it. So what's the point? Right. And so it became a bit sort of personally annoying and wasteful in my eyes. And so what I learned was a lot of the traditional means of training teachers, okay, which we refer to as professional development, was falling short and was coming across fairly antiquated in the face of all this new technology. And that is what ultimately led me to look at it from an outsider's view and say, you know what, there's ways we could address this. The traditional means aren't working, but I ended up getting passionate about it. And I'll pause after this, but ultimately decided when we were acquired by VMware, I wanted to create a more modern approach so that every teacher in a school district would adopt technology effectively, because if they don't, ultimately our students are going to suffer. And that's how MobileMind got started.
Awesome. There's a lot to unpack there. So I want to go back to the very first thought you mentioned that you had, because this is, and you said it was back in 2011, around that time when this conversation happened. And your initial reaction to being offered the opportunity to focus that original business or in the education space, you mentioned your initial reaction was just like, God, no, I don't want any part of that. And I'd love to hear more about that, because I think even though education and ed tech specifically has gotten a lot more attention, especially given the pandemic. Now, there's still most folks out there, and I've run into this myself in investor meetings and meetings with other folks, that the education space itself is just not one that you want to be in necessarily from a business perspective. Could you speak to that from where you started and now where you are now that you've been in it for a while?
Sure. And I can't speak to every different lens of people feeling what they feel, but there's a couple of different, you have to look at for me at that time, it was through the eyes of an individual contributor who is used to been selling to the Deltas and folks like that of the world, the enterprise grade stuff. So if I'm continuing as an individual contributor to think about what my career path is, it's not a good look. I'm just telling you the way it is, right? If you're on a resume and you're looking at, I sell enterprise software solutions to this industry vertical, and then I move to K-12, that narrative, just as someone who's trying to continue to build a career, doesn't necessarily work. It's just, it's not it's often unfortunately perceived, it is what it is, as a less sophisticated space. It went from a sales scenario, and that's one lens. Okay.
Sure.
And for me personally, I just chose to say, all right, forget it. I'm just going to drive on. I want to do it anyway because of these things. And for me, I wanted to have an opportunity to be in a much more significant leadership role in that company, early stage. And so that gave me the opportunity. Now, what I think happens a lot, and then you talk to even folks I've worked with in the past, very successful, smart people. Education technology just isn't the sexiest space. Certainly from an investor standpoint, sometimes the multiples on acquisitions aren't the same. I mean, you're not, cybersecurity, so-and-so got bought for, 15, 20x.
Right.
You don't typically see those kind of multiples in the edtech space. And so I think that might be the lens of certain investors. Now, if you go on Shark Tank and listen to Mark Cuban and folks like that, they love it, right? It just depends on what you're, certainly if you're a VC or an investor, it depends on what your profile is and what you want to do. And I also, some of the ed tech investors I've talked to, folks that just run or similar circles now, is that it's beyond just that stuff. It's, you can double bottom line. I get really fulfilled knowing that we've created this awesome software, we can make a direct impact, and, we're serving a purpose that is noble, right? And that personally, for me as a sales guy DNA, it sort of gives me license to just completely get after it, and know that it's very freeing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great point. I mean, because in that initial story you said about it not necessarily being like the sexy thing, I think that still holds, especially because, I mean, from a purely talent perspective, when you don't have a lot of investment and a lot of like quote unquote, innovation, I feel like we're also not getting enough talent on that side of the ball, especially technology wise, into this space either, right? It's this sort of, now, I don't know if you feel the same way, but I just feel like you don't hear a lot of computer science students being like, oh yeah, I can't wait to break into the ed tech scene, right? Like that's rarely what they're saying.
I can't say that I know that, but I believe that, I can see that being the case, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you started MobileMind, and what were the first few years like?
They actually have a title, right? Those first few years are called the blood, sweat, and tears years. All right. That's what those years are.
Sure.
And for anyone looking to start a company, I think, it's going to take longer than you think, et cetera. But for me, there's a happy ending to the way that we did it. But I would say, we did it, or I did it the hard way, in that I knew as a software guy who has a passion for technology, I wanted to build a platform, right? Something that was SaaS-based, cloud-based, that could solve the problems that I saw. Now, I only saw a few of those problems. I needed to crack the code on all the other problems. I wasn't some 22-year-old going through an incubator in the West Coast and someone's going to give me $5 million on an idea. That wasn't going to happen. Right. I had some had good relationships with, I met some really good angel investors in town, and AirWatch was a success story. So we're coming off of that, and we had a lot of our tradition or customers from AirWatch needed a lot of help around change management, okay, and in the edtech space, and a lot of consulting around some of the AirWatch stuff that we had developed, but also around professional development. So initially I said, okay, what we're going to do, it sounds like a great plan. And just let me go ahead and give you the caveat that nothing turned out the way that I really wanted it to.
Naturally.
But started in and said, okay, we're going to go and we're going to develop this, kind of three things we're working on: support, change management, professional development. We're going to go in and we're going to work with these customers, figure out what the problem is. We're going to do some research on PD, and then we're going to start to crack the code on the problem, and then we'll scale it and we'll develop a software solution, and then we'll go from there. So great plan. I'm not a traditional services guy, frankly. I don't gravitate to services. I don't really like them. And so we had a hard time just, staying afloat the first couple of years, right? And just making it happen. And, but we made it through. Good deal. Those efforts served us. We don't do any of that. So we don't do any sort of consulting services, things like that. But it did allow us to figure out what the heck we were going to build. So when we got to the point in 2017 that I was building software, I emphatically knew 100%. And I don't say that like from an ego standpoint, because it was so hard. I knew what we were developing was good to go. I knew that people wanted it. I knew the problems it was going to solve. So we were not throwing darts. And so when I first developed our minimum viable product, even the first demos, it was just the best software I've demoed. So while it was hell for a few years, the outcome was great. So our software went live in 2018. So I think 3 years of R&D and the blood, sweat, and tears. Yeah. And then we went live, and so it's a pure SaaS company. That's what we've been. Do
you think that you needed that time? You would have needed that time no matter what industry you're in, or do you think there's something particularly complex about education, all the moving parts and all the different factors, both on the technical side, the people side, and the business side?
Yeah, no, education, it has a very big barrier to entry. And that is comprised of things like, state contracts, how you sell things. I mean, there's just a lot of this government, quasi-government nuances that go into that vertical. And fortunately, I was familiar with that through my AirWatch days. I knew how to sell through the channel. And if and we do a little bit of that, but you learn the nuances of the space. So once you're in there, you can, it's I guess it's harder for other people who have never been in the space to fast follow you or jump in the space. And you really need to cut your teeth in the space for a while to understand it.
Right.
It is very different than selling to the enterprise. There's good and bad things with that. So yeah, in general, I think it is a difficult space, but once you're there, it can be extremely lucrative, and in a lot of different ways, both monetarily and emotionally, things we talked about before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because it's one of the things, I am obviously a former teacher myself, and now in the tech space as well. And so I know the space from a teacher's perspective, but so you sort of just alluded to, like, there's a whole other side to it. The bureaucracy side of public education is enormous. And whenever you're starting a business, you have to have a good product. You also have to be able to sell the product. And so selling the product in the education space, it depending on who you're trying to get it to, can be all sorts of things. And so do you feel like, I'd love to hear about lessons you've learned in trying to get your solution to folks in the education space. And then I'm curious if you think there are any things that the space itself should be considering, like trying to do differently if it wants to let a little bit more innovation happen, or at least speed up the cycle of innovation.
Yeah. So first thing, and I'll just take the channel example, and you and I talked briefly about this when we first met. It's coming from AirWatch, and if you're not familiar with the channel, let's just call it the reseller channel. The big companies that sell technology to schools. So if I'm a school district, I'll go to my, the big example, the CDW rep or the SHI rep, and I'll say, hey, I need to buy X number of laptops or Chromebook, and I need some whatever. And those are the companies that really are on the state contract with different districts, et cetera. So coming from AirWatch, where we were a fully matured product, and that all the resellers were like just clamoring to sell us. Okay. So
Yep.
that puts you in a mode of, oh, the channel's great, right? And I didn't see all the early product, you know, getting up to the state where, you know, you got to sell direct before you can sell the channel. That's the bottom line. Okay. You got to know yourself before you can know your channel. And that's a mistake that a lot of technology folks makes. You know, when someone says, you know, let's say you have a non-selling background CEO, regardless of vertical, and they say, well, how are you going to go to market? Oh, we're going to use the channel. Okay, it's not just that easy, right?
Right.
Those people are selling lots of stuff. So I think that's a common mistake for folks. And I made that mistake when I started MobileMind. I was like, I called all my channel buddies up who I had made a lot of money at Airwatch, and they did me as well, right? It's mutually beneficial. And I'm like, hey, guess what? I started this company and we're going to go do this, and they're like, man, that's awesome. And then, you know, crickets.
Right.
Because I'm skipping steps. So that is a big example of a nuance to the ed tech space and how you may need those guys, right? So that's an example of that, of where I made the mistake. And right now, the resellers, yes, people sell us, but our hands are in our own destiny. Our direct sales model is fantastic in the way that I only say that we've evolved it. It's good to go. Far more important to me. Ultimately, when we get super big, then the channel will come banging on our door and saying, I really want to sell this now, right?
Right.
That's that. And what was the second part? I'm sorry.
The second part was really just about if you're you know, working inside of a district or inside of a school. I'm curious if you think there are ways that districts and schools could make the path to working with them, or even just to creating new solutions or coming up with new ideas easier, or at least like trying to make it more of like a collaborative experience. I just feel like it's always very hard to get into these different buildings in front of these folks because it feels like change is constant. And so anytime there's a new tool or a new practice, it's like, all right, well, that's just another new thing. We don't have time for that. Is there anything you think they could do systematically to make it a little bit more inviting?
Well, I do think you've seen, as mobile and cloud technology have come into the ed tech space, there has been a convergence of somewhat of a convergence between different silos. So let's take before mobile devices, for example, you had teachers that would take their kids down to the Dell computer lab for IT time, right?
Yeah.
And then you had the IT department running that. They didn't talk to the teacher.
Right.
And so I do think that devices have disrupted that model. Once devices got in the classroom, IT folks now started to care what's happening in the classroom with these devices. We're buying them, we're configuring them. And I think that has had a good disruptive effect where IT leaders now care things like professional development. So if my teachers don't know how to use the devices and I'm trying to create a successful initiative and they're not getting adopted, now the stakeholder has other cares that traditionally they might not have. So I think that's something that is organically happening that is good for the space where people are, more that curriculum and instructional technology. We're talking more with C-level folks. So that does give sort of maybe a unified front on what kind of solutions they're looking at. Because there is the other problem of mobile technology in schools. I've heard it called NIFTYism, where you've got teachers who are like, oh, I found this app and I'm going to go grab this app. It's for free and I'm going to use it for my kids in the classroom. And there's tons of cool stuff, but that is not, it doesn't connect to the district's overarching technology initiative. So I think from their level, I think some districts are very different. The more districts can align to a specific goal and back into what technology solutions support that goal, sounds like common sense, will always happen, the better, right? I do think that you still have challenges with it's great that you've got all these federal funds coming in for districts and whatnot, but every one of them is used differently. It's distributed differently. And it's just that kind of thing. Anytime we can get rid of some of the red tape, which is very hard in a quasi-government or government scenario, I think it's better. I think bureaucracy in these cases don't serve us 100% of the time, when we're trying to innovate, right? Or become more lean. Like, there's a lot to unpack there, man. Honestly, I mean, I think about this stuff a lot.
I think you took a good whack at that one.
Be overhauled.
Yeah, it's a crazy question. Mainly because the system, like like you alluded to, is like, it's so layered and it's so dependent on who you're talking to. It's funny, like before my time here, I was in the nonprofit space, and there was this saying in the nonprofit space about foundations. They would always say, if you've met one foundation, you've met one foundation. And because they're all slightly different, all their boards are different. And I think it's very much the same way about schools and districts. Like, they literally can be so different. They have similar like general processes, but getting to a lot of them can be really hard. And I also think the point you made about a district level set of goals and priorities around technology that actually aligns down to the teacher level is very rare. And a part of it is there's just so much new technology, and with COVID now accelerating all of it. But I think it's a great point, and hopefully we'll see more of that in the years to come. So now I want to talk about Atlanta for a second. And maybe I'm wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like the Atlanta edtech scene isn't really a scene yet. Like, there's not a lot of us out here. I'd like to think that I've encountered most of us, but I've met you, I've met Michael, and I know a few others who are similar, like, stages to myself, which is pretty early stage. But outside of that, I'm really not finding a lot of folks and a lot of support. Just like, when you look at other spaces where big companies have innovation centers, and everybody's partnered with Georgia Tech and with the AUC and with, all these different places. But I feel like the education space isn't getting that. Do you see that from where you sit and your time in here? And if so, like, why do you think that is?
I don't know why that is historically. I don't know why, DC is a bigger ed tech space, or some other areas where you see a lot more, VC focused investors just for ed tech. I honestly don't know. If I gave it some deep thought, I'm sure I could come up with some ideas, but at the end of the day, I know that that's the case, and I got to deal with it accordingly. Right. So I've just kind of owned it. Right. I know guys I've worked with who are super successful people who I've learned a lot from, and I've talked to them about the space in the past, and they're like, I'm not going in the ed tech space.
Right.
So I think it's funny. But just in general, they're like, yeah, that space is not where you go. So I don't know why Atlanta isn't that way. It is what it is. I think if somebody says, what's in Atlanta like from a technology investment standpoint, I'd say, oh, it's cybersecurity and marketing automation. Okay, so I can throw a rock and hit, things like that, or sales automation, things like that, which is great. We got some killer companies, and we had a great tech scene, and we got great innovators and leaders.
Yep.
I think it's funny because you mentioned Michael Williamson, who's actually on the chair of my board now. Right. And, he started Longleaf and IO and all that good stuff. And I think that's probably the technology startup story I know. And I'm sure I'm not trying to marginalize anybody else that I'm missing. So, of course, when I met Michael, we just have socially, we knew each other. But when we got to stage, I'm like, oh, the super successful ed tech guy in the Atlanta scene, I'm going to grab him because he knows, come on my board so we can all coalesce together.
Yeah.
You do have companies like Promethean, which was out of Alpharetta. They moved to, which is smart boards, all that. I think they're new corporates in Seattle. But other than that, I'm just not, I just don't see a lot of it like you do. And I don't know why. It is what it is, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just the tech scene overall is still like relatively young here, and so I imagine that the education tech part probably is like the last group within because right now in ed tech, it feels like the typical players or typical locations are where the most popular is: New York, San Francisco, and I'm sure some other, New Orleans probably has a decent scene because they've been about ed reform for a while. But maybe it's just that, right? Maybe it's the fact that like tech scene comes first and then education comes last within the tech scene itself. Maybe not last.
Well,
but,
no, but I get it. But that would make sense actually, and sort of follow suit with a lot of other examples of who goes first and who follows towards the end. So, I do, and if people start to look at it, again, when you're past the barrier of entry, it's especially now, COVID, just ripped off, the Band-Aid of awareness on how many areas of disparity there are within the ed tech scene, and what that does is it increases opportunity. And I've talked to a ton of people that are like, oh, I want to get in the ed tech space now. I want to get in the ed tech space. And I'm like, well, hold your horses. It's very different, right?
Right.
So, but I do think things like that, I do think, and I didn't ask this question, but I do think this event has absolutely put a steroid shot in the arm of education technology, the COVID event. So that may change things as well. So people may start thinking about it more and like, oh, there's an area that we can capitalize on and create new tech for it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I'm curious to see where that energy like stays and where it goes. Like there's a lot of folks feel like who are going with they're developing solutions directly for the student, where it's sort of like self-directed learning, it's like automated pacing, adaptive learning. And then I'm sure I'm just curious whether it's gonna, a lot of the solutions are gonna try to cut the teacher out or change the teacher role, or if they're gonna be focused more systems level, where honestly a lot more of the money is. Because if you're trying to build a business, the districts are the ones with most of the money. Like selling to schools, which I can attest to personally, it's nice, but you got to go to a lot of schools to actually build a nice business. And so I'm curious where you think the space is going to head after COVID. After we get out of this, what do you think, or what trends are you seeing or hearing about with technology and education?
Yeah, I think you are going to see, I think COVID has brought awareness to a lot of different segments within the ed tech space. I think you're going to see some consolidations. I think there's some that are already happening around spaces that maybe normally people weren't thinking about as much. I think professional development is definitely a space. Our thing has always been, okay, for example, you can throw a rock and hit 100 apps or software companies that focus on personalization of learning for students.
Right.
Great, you should do that. What about personalization of learning for the adults?
Yeah.
They're no different. You got teachers who don't know what the cloud is and teachers who are ready to go to the moon with technology. How do we not differentiate between those? So, and that has always been, and luckily for us, it's getting a lot more awareness now. And what COVID did is it made everyone go, oh, wait, 80% of our teachers don't know how to use this technology remotely. And then, we've got this platform that does that, but not to focus on us, but that's an example. I think you're going to see consolidation of technology. And I think there's going to be a lot of funding and a lot of focus on how do we prevent things like learning loss, meaning, we have been in this pandemic and everyone has, so this is a trend, I think, where everyone's saying we're so concerned that now there's two sides of it, that people have been lost along the way, students lost along the way through the COVID thing, but also when they come back, there's a big fear that all the teachers stop using the technology that they've all just learned to use and go back to their traditional means.
Right.
And so those are new challenges that are now there because of this, that I think will continue to create new trends. I think integrated systems, consolidation, more enterprise grade solutions in schools for sure. I think you'll see a lot of that. I think probably, I know it's pretty vague, but consolidation of certain areas, I think is going to be.
No, I mean, I tell people all the time, if they want to see something interesting, they should go on to Google Images and Google EdTech landscape, and they will find 1,000 different versions of the landscape, which if once you get into this stuff, you realize like how people see the space is part of how they see their business. And in education, like no one has the space built the same way and laid out the same way. And I think you're absolutely right. It's just like right now there's a flood of money going in because of COVID. And a lot of it is content specific or personalized learning specific. And, frankly, my personal opinion is both of those are very crowded and only getting more crowded. But yeah, I mean, it feels like it's inevitable that the space will start having more integrated systems to some extent.
Yeah, and I'll tell you one thing that I learned early on. Let's take student information systems, for example. Sure. When we were in the AirWatch days, people were asking, hey, can you integrate with XYZ student information system for a variety of reasons for our software?
Yep.
So when we first started looking at that, I think like 2012, 2013, I started looking at, okay, is there sort of a common set of APIs we can use to integrate with all these? No, because unlike the enterprise space, there isn't just SAP, old days people, there's only 3 or 4 main things. There was like 150. Right. So that tells me that's a perfect example of and a lot of companies actually made companies like Clever and ClassLink started making a lot of money on being the middleware for those guys, for those systems. But that's a perfect example. You have these big enterprise grade systems and you have so many of them, which is not
Right.
normal. So the space, and it's like in a lot of things. So the actual vertical it's very fragmented. And that's kind of the tack that we take. Is it kind of a hard task to defragment a market? Sure.
Right.
But that's that's the tack that we're taking around professional learning. So,
Yeah.
and I think this is the time to do that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you look at the biggest companies, like something like a Power School, is first of all they're buying companies left and right,
Exactly.
and they're still market share wise, depending on what you're looking at, still fairly limited compared to other industries potentially. So definitely see.
That's exactly. Power School is the exact example. When I first learned it, I'm like, oh, these are the big guys. This must have 70-80%. It's
Right.
like, I forget what it was, but
I think it was
something
like
very small.
25 or 30% or
Yeah.
something. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So I want to close out looking ahead. We were just talking about post COVID. Now let's talk about post COVID. Hopefully, we don't experience more pandemics between now and the year 2050. But this is the question we like to finish these conversations with to get us thinking ahead, then hopefully trying to design towards the futures that we want. So I'd love to finish with hearing your answer about what do you think education should look like by the year 2050?
I, you know, and that's like a tall order question, right?
Yeah.
And it's cool. I would love it to look like, and we talked about this before briefly. I'd love it to look like Ready Player One.
Mhm.
I am a high nerd on VR, AR. You hear a lot of talk, and I don't, about equity, which is equity of learning and equity of learning access. How's everyone getting internet access when they're in places that they can't? I mean, and that's we should be thinking about that. I mean, especially like during this COVID time, you've had kids had to go home, they don't have internet access. Okay, what are they supposed to
Yeah.
do?
Right.
So, but I do think that generally address things like VR, AR can address really awesome experiences that you otherwise couldn't achieve unless you went somewhere else. All right. So
Mhm.
just logistically, I think I would like to see that technology used. A perfect example is like, oh, we can use Google Earth to go visit somewhere virtually and experience that. I
Right.
think our education system and our students in this country have a real problem with they are in a very closed vacuum. When I talk to a lot of people, even young graduates, they don't seem to know about things like history, or they're contextually unaware of so many things that surprise me. And when I think about technology as a change agent, that's what I do. I think, well, if we're not using the technology right, you're not getting exposed to any of this stuff. Okay. And
Right.
that's just not good for our country and our society as a whole. And it's not good to develop human beings. So I think that VR and AR, really cool elements that should be incorporated to expose us to realities that we otherwise might not be exposed to. So that's one thing. The second thing, and I don't know how that looks in 2050.
Right.
And the other thing is it's super cool stuff, and I just want to wear a headset and go around
Right.
and do things. The other thing is just the notion of that personalized learning. When I went to college, I had challenges with certain subjects. I was luckily I went to University of Georgia, and I had they had a huge testing facility for testing for attention deficit disorder.
Yep.
And I didn't even think I was going to bring this up, but it's no big deal. But I found that I had certain gaps in certain areas, right? And so that's what they call a deficit of learning.
Mm.
So if we could understand that, it might be if we could use technology to teach individuals differently, and not a one size fits all, which is what we do for teachers. I think a lot of people want to go that way, and I think it just makes so much sense. And because what we'll find if we could crack the code on how people learn, and that's going to shape interest earlier, and you might find that people can pursue other careers, whether it's trade crafts or anything else. I don't think our schools are. I think we could do our education system could do a far better job of getting people prepared for things that truly align with them, right? And I think we'd have a much more productive society if everyone was going in those different directions that were really germane to how they learn. And ultimately, I think that's going to bring them more joy and be more productive folks. So I'd like to see those areas really affected and start to see a more modern approach on those types of things within the education system as a whole. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I'll certainly do my part.
Yeah, well, I mean, I love everything you said. You should definitely read Ready Player 2 to see where they took it, because that's probably where this is going. But yeah, it's funny, as you're one of the few technology folks we've talked to, because we've focused on Atlanta voices. We've already talked about the Atlanta edtech scene being where it is. And you're the first to mention AR and VR, and it's augmented reality and virtual reality for those who are not familiar. But it's funny because there's a lot of themes coming out of this. It's can we make it more personalized, more experiential, more applied? Can we figure out what people want earlier? And I mean, there's no doubt that technology is going to have a huge hand in that, one way or the other. So I think it's, incumbent upon us to start coming up with the solutions now and designing, in the way that we want them. But this has been awesome. This is, again, Tyce Miller, founder and CEO of MobileMind, professional development company based here in Atlanta, rarity around here. And we really appreciate you taking the time and sharing all the lessons learned along the way.
Hey, man, I'm very grateful that you asked me to attend. And I hope folks who watch this get something out of it. Happy to be part of it. And again, very grateful. So thank you, Ian. I really appreciate it, buddy.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
All right. Talk to you soon.